right across the entire Russian political spectrum. No means no, and that's what the Russians were saying then. And of course, we've had conflict in Ukraine ever since. We've had 3 years of war. The Russians stand on the brink of victory. But Keir Starmer must come along and insist that Ukraine is on an irreversible course towards NATO in spite of all of that. And he also, as I said, talks about peacekeepers, sending peacekeepers to Ukraine, even though Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, who's on his way to Saudi Arabia, by the way, to meet the Americans, I will come to that shortly, he has said that for the Russians, having NATO contingents, military contingents from NATO countries in Ukraine would be problematic, to say the least. The Russians basically have already rejected that outright. And on the whole topic of peacekeepers, Vasily Nebenzia, the Russian ambassador to the United Nations, recently made the point that peacekeepers can only be deployed according to international law to a conflict zone through a decision of the UN Security Council. And of course, Russia has a veto right on the UN Security Council and can therefore veto any decision to send peacekeepers. A point that only struck me a little while later, by the way, is that Nebenzia's comment about the UN Security Council being the only body authorized to permit the deployment of peacekeepers actually goes beyond that, because if the UN Security Council authorizes the deployment of peacekeepers to any area of conflict, it usually does so for only a limited period of time, generally a few years at most. And what is then supposed to happen is that the matter goes back to the Security Council once that limited period of time ends, and at that point the Security Council must decide whether to renew the mandate for the peacekeepers. And of course, what that means is that, well, let's just assume that a decision is eventually made to deploy peacekeepers to Ukraine. I think this is most unlikely myself, but let's just assume that that were to be agreed and that it did happen. According to Nebenzia, it would have to be authorized by the UN Security Council. Almost certainly, in fact, definitely, the Russian procedure were followed, so the peacekeepers would only be deployed for a limited period of time, perhaps 1 or 2 years. The matter would then revert to the Security Council, and if the Russians did not agree, then that period ended to extend the mandate. If the Russians, in fact, were to vote against extending the mandate, if they were to exercise their veto rights to do so, then the mandate would end, and according to law, and almost certainly in practice, peacekeepers would have to leave. So what Nebenzia is saying not only gives the Russians veto power over deployment of peacekeepers at all, but it also means that the Russians would have the right to veto extension of the mandate of the peacekeepers to remain at some future time. In other words, the Russians would to time limit the period that the peacekeepers were there, and insist on leave, in effect, to have them booted out. So, just saying. So, anyway, Sir Keir Starmer disregards all of this. He's not listening to what the Russians are saying. He's not listening to what the Americans are saying. He nonetheless comes out and says these things, these extraordinary and outrageous things. He consists in taking the hardest possible line, and he does so, and it's important to say this, with the full backing of the entire political class in Britain. There is no significant figure in Britain who is speaking out against any of this. Nigel Farage, a couple of months ago, wrote a piece in the Daily Telegraph questioning whether, in fact, Russia's war in Ukraine was indeed unprovoked. Farage made the entirely valid point that the war was, on the contrary, undoubtedly provoked through Western insistence that Ukraine would one day join NATO. I remember that the entire British political class united against Farage when he said that. There was a colossal outcry against him. And he's been very careful since then to keep his head down on this issue and to say nothing further about it. So as I said, there is no real dissent from Starmer's line, which, incidentally, I have no doubt. I know that there are various people who think that Starmer is playing some clever he's signing off 100-year agreements with the Ukrainians. Ukraine will survive 1 month, let alone 2 months, let alone 100 years. This is serious about the irreversible course of Ukraine towards NATO, or about the deployment of the peacekeepers and all of those things. I'm going to say this, I believe that Keir Starmer believes in fact, I have knowledge that he does believe every single thing he is saying. Indeed, I've heard reports about some of the things that he has been discussing with ministers and officials. I can't unfortunately say what they are, but when I heard about them, they left me absolutely incredulous, demonstrating how completely out of touch with the actual situation Keir Starmer actually is. Anyway, that's him. He is taking the hardest possible line. He's backed by his friends in Scandinavia, the Norwegians, the Swedes, the Finns, and the Danes. Scandinavia has gone from a position of approximate neutrality. It was known during the Cold War that Sweden leaned strongly towards the Americans, and Finland was in the Soviet sphere of influence. But overall, it was widely understood that despite that, they were basically neutral. They went through the motions of pretending. Anyway, they've gone from that position during the Cold War to one of fervid Atlanticism and implacable Russia, and very much as in Britain, they take the most extreme, the hardest possible, the most bitterly anti-Russian line that it is possible. And they're joined in that by the Baltic states as well, which famously a week ago disconnected themselves from the Russian electricity grid, pronounced that this was freedom, and have apparently, as a result, experienced a quadruple I believe that this is actually the case, that electricity prices in the Baltic states have quadrupled. I might be overstating it a bit, that they have shot up by staggering levels. That, I understand, is indisputable fact. Anyway, those three countries, the Baltic states, the Scandinavians, the British, they can all be assumed at this meeting in Paris to be taking the hardest possible line. And on some of these points, Starmer will also receive the backing of his partner in crime, if I can call him that, the Napoleon of Europe, the Caesar of the Seine, the genius of the Elysee, Emmanuel Macron. He, of course, was the first person about a year ago to float the possibility of sending European troops to Ukraine. This is massively unpopular with the French people. I understand and believe that it is massively unpopular within the French army as well. But nonetheless, he continues to insist on it. He's been talking about how it is essential that Europe find some means to prevent the capitulation of Ukraine. This is what Macron is saying. He's resurrecting again plans for European armies and all of that. Anyway, he, at least at this meeting in Paris, which of course it was he Macron, took the decision to convene it. Anyway, he will no doubt be supporting Starmer in all of this as well. No one else. Apparently the Germans, and I understand that this is a consensus, I understand that both Scholz and Merz are in agreement about this. The Germans have said that they will not agree to send any troops as a peacekeeping force to Ukraine. Poland has made the same decision. Donald Tusk has said, will Poland as a peacekeeping force to Ukraine? The reality is that since the start of the special military operation, the Poles have sent lots and lots of troops to Ukraine. They've sent lots of troops who have been serving there, purportedly as volunteers or as mercenaries. The Russians complain about their presence all the time. Poland has provided Ukraine with huge amounts of weapons and military material. I think I'm right in saying that Poland has been the biggest single supplier of tanks, for example, to Ukraine. They're not so visible because they are essentially Soviet T-72s, which Poland can build under license, a license granted to Poland when it was a member of the Warsaw Pact by the Soviets during the Cold War. The Poles have regularly updated and improved these T-72s, and of course the Poles have provided all sorts of other weapon systems as well. Every day, well, not every day, but quite often, you read from Russian Defense Ministry reports of Polish weapon systems being destroyed by the Russian army on the Ukrainian battlefields. Crab self-propelled guns, in particular, provided to Ukraine from Poland, seem to be amongst the special weapon systems that the Russian Defense Ministry most singles out whenever any one of them has been destroyed. So Poland is not going to send troops to Ukraine. They've already suffered, as I understand it, very significant losses during the period of the special military operation. The Polish public is tired and disenchanted about the conflict in Ukraine. There have been constant tensions since basically 2023 between the Polish and Ukrainian governments, both the existing government and the previous government led by the Law and Justice Party. Poles often pose as staunch, even fervid supporters of Ukraine, but beneath the surface it's clear that they're not keen at all. And my sense is that all of the other European countries are going to basically follow the line taken by Germany and Poland. They will not send troops to Ukraine. I think it is inconceivable, for example, that the Czechs, the other Balkan states, Italy has of course always ruled out any possibility of deploying forces to Ukraine. Anyway, all of the European countries so far, apart from the British and the French, and perhaps the Baltic states, have ruled out sending troops to Ukraine. And the fact that the Americans have said unequivocally, Pete Hegseth said this in his speech to the Munich Security Conference, the Americans have said unequivocally that any European troops deployed to Ukraine will not be protected by the United States under American, will not be provided with American security guarantees. I am sure that most European states, that settles the matter. They are not going to send their troops into harm's way, facing off against the terrifying Russian army without a guarantee of American protection. Now, on that topic, I would say that for a few short hours after Pete Hegseth spoke, all sorts of people claimed or pretended to claim that though Pete Hegseth was ruling out deployment of ground forces to Ukraine, the possibility that the US could provide air cover, that was still open. Well, I have words, I've read them through precisely, and I always thought that was desperate, and I can see definitely that it emphatically is desperate. And he says if his actual words were as follows: if these troops are deployed as peacekeepers to Ukraine at any point, and notice if, in other words, Pete Hegseth leaves open the possibility that they might not be. Just saying, if these troops are deployed as peacekeepers to Ukraine at any point, they should be deployed as part of a non-NATO mission, and they should not be covered under Article 5. To be clear, as part of any security guarantee, there will not be US troops deployed to Ukraine. So that doesn't speak of ground forces. It refers to US troops generically, and I take that to mean that the United States is not going to provide air cover either. I think people have read those words of Pete Hegseth and have inserted into them meanings that simply are not there. And as I said, I think most European states understand that, and they will not agree to deploy forces without guarantees of American protection. So I think this whole idea of sending peacekeepers to Ukraine is going to be stillborn. I think it's all but inconceivable that the Russians will agree. If they do agree, it will be on the strictest possible terms set out by Valentia, but I don't think that is in fact at all Russian intention. I think that the Russians have consistently said that they do not want European troops, NATO troops, or troops of NATO countries in Ukraine, and I'm sure that will be the position they will stick to. They have previously consistently rejected, even before the start of the special military operation, even during the period when there were attempts still being made to make the Minsk agreement work. The Russians consistently opposed deployment of peacekeepers to Ukraine. There was no word of sending peacekeepers to Ukraine as part of the Istanbul agreement, and I don't think the Russians are going to withdraw from that, and I don't think that is going to happen, or at least troops from Britain and France are not going to go to Ukraine as peacekeepers. Anyway, just to move on. So, already we see the division. Starmer wants to unite the Europeans to get them to send a large army to Ukraine. Most European countries, despite their anger, despite their fury, despite the fear that stalks all of them, won't agree. And as for the irreversible course towards NATO, well, of course, there's already lots of European countries which are members of NATO. Which already don't agree with that. Hungary, Slovakia, before long, the Czech Republic, after Mr. Babiš is re-elected, if he is re-elected. Romania, perhaps, after Mr. Gheorghiu becomes president, he is allowed to become president. I don't think this is going to happen either. In fact, I'm sure that it isn't going to happen, because the Russians, again, are going to insist that it doesn't happen. And as they have won the war, or are winning the war, they are unequivocal. So what is the point of this meeting? Just as Fred Flight says, what are they really going to discuss? Well, Hungary's very astute foreign minister has now said that this is in reality a meeting of people who want to ensure that the war continues. The way he put it earlier today, Paris will host a meeting of those who've been constantly adding fuel to Ukraine for the last 3 years. These countries are for the war. They have supported the misguided strategy of sanctions. These states have escalated the conflict. Today, the parties supporting the war are coming together in Paris, and they oppose Trump. They want to do everything in their power to prevent a peaceful resolution of the Ukraine conflict. And frankly, that is exactly what this meeting, in the end, is about. They're not really looking to send Ukraine. They don't really expect Ukraine to join NATO. They're creating problems, obstacles. They're trying to sabotage the progress of the discussions between the Americans and the Russians. And when eventually the Russians square off with the Ukrainians across the negotiating table, as will eventually happen, they want to ensure that the Ukrainians feel, or are led to believe, that the Europeans are there behind them and will continue to support them. If they reject any US or Russian proposal that might lead to peace, so that the war can continue. And Zelensky appears to be playing along. He has just made further statements to the effect that if Ukraine doesn't participate in the discussions, then it will simply reject any outcome that comes out of the discussions between the Americans and the Russians. Ukraine will not compromise, apparently. It will not agree to any significant concessions. Even if the Americans walk away, it will continue the war. And in fact, the giveaway in all of this, in what was really going on in Paris, was, I understand, made not by Prime Minister Starmer himself, but by one of his officials, who said that the objective is to prevent any division, any breakdown in the unity of the Western alliance, to keep Britain, NATO, the Europeans and the Americans, to hold them together. How do you do that? You do that by prolonging and protracting and continuing the war in Ukraine. Because if the Americans and the Russians start talking to each other, if they start coming to agreements with each other, if they start developing a relationship with each other, then the value of NATO for the Americans diminishes, and so does the value of America's European allies. And having heard what Pete Hegseth and J.D. Vance had to say, the British, French, all of them in fact, are saying to themselves, if the Americans and the Russians do reach agreements with each other, if the war in Ukraine is brought to an end and is put to one side, the Americans are going to be provided with the space and the opportunity that they want to leave, and quite plausibly at that point they will leave, because, as they say themselves, with the rise of China, they have other priorities. So that's what this is all about. That is ultimately the true purpose of the meeting in Paris. It's not intended to come up with any constructive ideas. The Europeans have no constructive ideas. Keir Starmer has no ideas at all. As I said, he's still stuck on Ukraine joining NATO and British troops being sent to Ukraine, and Macron is no different. It's all about undermining the prospects of a negotiated solution, one brokered by the Americans and agreed by the Russians, a solution which could potentially bring the war to an end, and which might lead to the Americans quitting Europe and going away, as in their very different ways Pete Hegseth and J.D. Vance have both hinted at. Well, this is sterile, it's negative, it is not in any way putting forward constructive ideas. In fact, what it represents is the bankruptcy of policy and diplomacy. It means choosing war over peace. It means choosing more dead Ukrainians over live ones. It means more destruction of Ukrainian cities. It means the perpetuation of divisions in Europe and the indefinite perpetuation of conflict with Russia. The Americans are becoming tired with it, so are some European countries. It is probably unsustainable over the long term, but it must be said that the British do have their friends in Washington. The neocons in Washington have not all disappeared. They still have their friends in Congress. It is not impossible that the Europeans, the Americans, the Europeans with the British at their lead, might succeed in throwing the negotiations off course, in preventing a settlement from being reached. Well, do they have alternatives? I've often said in many programs that even if there was little real prospect of intelligent alternatives being followed, it's always best to remember that they do exist, that decisions to make war and prolong war, even as that war is being lost, that those sort of decisions stem from conscious choices. And there's been a truly outstanding tweet by one of the most astute of commentators, Arnaud Bertrand. You can find it on X, in which he charts what alternative policies the Europeans might conceivably follow. He makes the point, which I've made already, that it's absolutely incredible that the Americans and the Russians are now talking about the security of Europe without the participation of the Europeans. Lavrov, by the way, has addressed this question today. He said, why would the Europeans be invited to participate when their approach is purely negative? They insist on sending arms to Ukraine. They insist on prolonging the war. So what purpose or function would be served by having them present in the talks, given that they are committed to prolonging the war? Their only purpose would be to wreck any peace talks so that the war could continue. Anyway, Arnaud Bertrand says it is absolutely unbelievable. It is incredible that we've come to this, that the affairs of Europe are being decided by two superpowers, America and Russia, without the direct participation of the European states. He says that this is a product of the unbelievable incompetence of the European leadership, about which he is perfectly right, and then he proposes alternatives. Now, I'm not sure that I agree with these alternatives or think that these alternatives are achievable, but I'm just going to read what he says. He says one idea would be to out-Trump Trump and to angle for a deal where the United States, not Europe, ends up the loser. I can't really see how that's possible myself, but anyway, he goes on to say they could, for instance, finally tell the truth about what led to the war in the first place, namely NATO expansion pushed by the United States, as well as the United States-led coup in Ukraine, and dissociate themselves from this, just the way Trump is very conveniently trying to dissociate himself from his own country's previous policies. The problem with doing that, of course, is that the Europeans were full accessories to all of those things. Many European states, including Britain, by the way, fully backed the 2008 decision at NATO's Bucharest summit to invite Ukraine to apply for NATO membership. Just saying. So they were full parties to that. And of course, European states, including some of the people who are in power in Europe today, were deeply implicated in the Maidan coup of 2014. One of the people who was actually present in Kiev at the time of the Maidan coup was none other than Radek Sikorski, who was at that time Foreign Minister of Poland, and who was, of course, a full member of the Polish government to this day. Just saying. Anyway, that's one thing that Arnaud Bertrand says. Then he says this: they could make it clear that they reject any deal that gives the United States access to any of Ukraine's resources, and signal to Russia that they're open to a different kind of security architecture in Europe, one that doesn't rely on US leadership or NATO. After all, if Trump can say he'll make deals with Putin, why couldn't Europe do the same? Absolutely. And here I am fully in agreement with Arnaud Bertrand. It seems to me that nothing at all prevents the European states from approaching the Russians themselves, saying to the Russians, look, this has all been an absolute catastrophe. Let's talk, let's see whether we can agree some long-term security arrangements for Europe, security arrangements which obviously involve ourselves and in which we obviously have a direct interest in order to bring peace and stability to the continent that we share. I'm not sure how the Russians would react to that. I'm not sure how Putin would react to that. But certainly it would be the obvious thing for the Europeans to do, except of course they're not doing it. And Arnaud Bertrand then goes on to say they could also reach out to China, which has already made it very clear that it opposed a deal in Ukraine without Europe at the table. That, I believe, actually is a misunderstanding of Chinese statements. I think that it's based on a report from Reuters, which I think greatly overstated what the Chinese actually had to say. But Arnaud Bertrand says that China is anyhow much better positioned to negotiate with Russia than Trump is. And I would add to that, even if Arnaud Bertrand is perhaps somewhat wrong about the Chinese position on the ongoing negotiations, it is absolutely true that the Chinese have repeatedly reached out to European leaders, to the Germans, to the French. Xi Jinping made a big effort to establish a good relationship with Macron. The Chinese have been very, very keen to establish a long-term, stable economic relationship with Europe. They've been frustrated and angered by the fact that the Europeans have shown little interest in achieving it. And as part of some sort of grand bargain, again, European states, if they had two brain cells to rub together, if they had any kind of active diplomacy, well, they could turn to China, they could work with the Chinese, and as part of some kind of grand bargain involving Russia and Ukraine, they could work with the Chinese to achieve a settlement in which they, the Europeans, had a central role and which they would themselves have helped to negotiate. Well, Arnaud Bertrand goes on to say that we could end up with a Europe freed from American tutelage for the first time since 1945, establishing a new multipolar equilibrium with China and Russia, turning Trump's attempt to exclude Europe into the very catalyst that finally enables European strategic autonomy. All absolutely true, but of course that reverses what the Europeans are actually trying to do. As we've seen, the British are saying that the most important thing is to preserve the alliance with the United States, and that's their objective. They want to maintain the system of American hegemony and tutelage because they believe falsely that by maintaining the collective West, that enables them, that is to say the British, the French, the Germans and all of the others, to strut across the world, play the game of being great powers, even though objectively they are of course no such thing, rely on American power, the backing of the United States, to fool everyone else in continuing to think that they are important. And they're so wedded to this that they want to prolong the war in order to keep the Americans in Europe rather than end it. But if you really care about Europe, if you think about Europe in the way that Arnaud Bertrand does, you'd be absolutely right. You would say, surely it's better for Europe to stand for itself, for European countries to rediscover their independence and autonomy again, to start behaving once more like real countries rather than like parts of the great jigsaw that is the collective West. I would say, by the way, and this is just by way of aside, that I think that one of the major reasons why in Britain there is so much of an obsession with the last years of the 1930s, the debates that took place right up to the moment of the declaration of war against Germany in September 1939. Why there have been so many books, so many articles written about this, why the Munich conference and what happened there is trotted out so often, why it is depicted in film after film and television show after television show, is because that is the last time when Britain acted entirely by itself and for itself without the American mentor and tutor hovering over just behind, basically pulling the strings. But as I said, they don't want that. That is not what the Europeans really want, certainly not what the British want. They want to keep their position as vassals to the hegemon in the great project of the collective West. They want to stick with what the German philosopher Nietzsche would have called the slave mentality, which they have developed over the last 80 years. So again, Arnaud Bertrand is right, but it's important to say that that is not what the Europeans want. And then Arnaud Bertrand finishes, this would require a level of strategic thinking that current European leaders have consistently shown themselves incapable of. Instead, I'm afraid they'll continue their current path of attempting to maintain the facade of transatlantic unity, even as they're being openly humiliated. And about that, he is absolutely right, and I hope I have explained why. Anyway, there we are. A bankrupt summit led by bankrupt leaders who have no positive ideas to offer, no constructive suggestions to take forward, who wasted the last 3 years trying to win an unwinnable war, who sacrificed probably hundreds of thousands of Ukrainian lives to that enterprise, who have destroyed Ukraine, who have isolated themselves and humiliated Europe, but they can't let go. They won't give up, and they will persist, and we'll have more declarations and more pronouncements from them over the next couple of hours. Probably you'll be getting some of those pronouncements even as this program goes up. because they're so frustrated and so angry that they're being excluded from the discussions, and are so horrified that the world that they have known, one in which they're vassals of the United States, but vassals who can pretend that they're part of a joint enterprise, that world is coming to an end. There's an astonishing video in which the German official who was tasked with organizing and chairing the Munich Security Conference breaks down into tears because of what has happened. And I think that what happened over the course of that conference, and I think that basically summarizes both the feelings and the realities in today's Europe, at least amongst its